everybody on the panel, if you want to share your thoughts about the situation about the 221Gs.
I have some information. I think, Tanya, maybe I'll start unless Carl or Jacob want to start.
Go ahead, Chris.
Right. So INA 212 5A, the letter that was referenced there. What that says is that in order to get a green card, one must have a labor certificate. This appears to be a training issue at the Manila consulate. Labor certificates are actually not required for nurses or physical therapists. They're required for just about every other occupation. So number one, if you're getting the 5A, that appears to be an error. There is a chance, however, that the embassy is tagging the refusal under 5A, but they're just sort of using that generally as a reason to deny the case. Because sort of the other leading theory as to what's happening over in Manila over the last 6 or 8 weeks or so is that there's been a misinterpretation about the validity of employment contracts. And of course, employment contracts are very much a part of this process. The recruiting industries simply, if they could not work with nurses from the Philippines to sign employment contracts, the recruiting agencies just wouldn't exist. No one is going to recruit a nurse if there's no guarantee that she's going to work for the facility in the United States for 2 or 3 years or whatever the contract is. That's sort of a necessary part of the process. I even think that the contract is in the nurse's best interest. Again, if there were not employment contracts, the entire immigration of nurses in the United States would be a trickle, because all of the recruiters just simply couldn't build a business around it. And it's actually the building of the business of recruiting and then placing and staffing, which is what allows the entire industry to thrive. So the first reason, again, just to reiterate, could be, or at least directly, A5 or 5A is the lack of a labor certificate. That is just simply a training issue. And then the second issue, which I actually think may be really driving this, is an issue with the Manila embassy or the U.S. embassy in Manila not understanding employment contracts. So that's all the bad news. The good news is I know a lot of us are working on this issue. I've been in contact with probably a half a dozen U.S. Congressional and senatorial offices over the last few weeks. I've also been working with some folks that we do some lobbying in Washington, D.C. on. They are actively engaged. I was on a conference call yesterday afternoon with about 15 different people, and we're all laser focused on this issue. I think, again, in terms of putting this in terms of good news and bad news, I'm optimistic that this will be solved. Over my career, I've seen the U.S. embassies, in particular Manila, because that's where we have a large part of our practice. We've seen Manila misinterpret rules, and what happens is when there's a large volume of people all going through the embassy, once the rule gets misinterpreted, it gets misinterpreted for dozens and dozens and maybe even 100 nurses, as we've seen here. That's the bad news. The good news is these issues always get resolved, but unfortunately, dealing with the U.S. government takes some time. We're putting a lot of pressure on the embassy. I've had even an indirect conversation with someone actually in the Department of State, in the administration in Washington, D.C., who as of earlier this week wasn't even aware that the embassy in Manila was doing this. And then compounding the entire problem is that there's currently not an immigrant visa chief at the embassy. That position remains unfilled, which compounds the problem because there's not a boss there to correct everything. So again, that's all the bad news, but the good news is I am optimistic that this is going to get fixed in the near term. In terms of what timeline, I have no idea. Could it happen next week? Sure. Could we still be dealing with this in April? I don't think so, but it's within the realm of possibility. I would suggest, however, that if you have an appointment in Manila in the next few weeks, that you seek to postpone that, because if you don't and you get your visa refused, it will get sent back to the service center where, frankly, it will actually ultimately get reapproved and sent back to Manila. But that could take, I've seen it take as long as a year, and maybe Jacob and Carl can speak to their experience with cases where the visa gets refused and then pushed back to the service center. So I do think that if you're going through Manila in the next few weeks, that you consider postponing your appointment, because there's no point going there to either get your visa put into an administrative processing or, worse yet, sent back to the Texas or Nebraska service center. And then the only other item here is if you're going through another embassy, but you're listening in on this, so you're a Filipino who's going through maybe England, the UK, London, or the UAE, one of the Gulf countries, they're all fine there. Everything's coming through with no problem in any of those other embassies. We haven't seen, so this problem seems entirely localized to Manila.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that we have clients who go through other embassies and they don't have that issue.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that, Chris, this seems to be an issue with other embassies as well, where something happens and then everybody else copies. We have the same issue in Israel right now, where they're denying cases of E2 based on marginality because people already have employees working for the company. And all the offices are doing the same thing. And I think we have the same issue here, that cases get denied because somebody decided that they're going to deny it for one reason and everybody else is following them.
Paul, anything to add?
Yeah, lucky guy, I guess. I haven't had a single denial out of Manila. So I was just going to ask Chris, since he's been so involved with this. Chris, is this happening particularly with outsourcing agencies, or does it happen with direct employers as well?
No, direct employers as well. We've got several hospital groups that have had several dozen cases put into administrative processing. I don't believe we've had any outright refused yet, though, but it seems to be across the board, whether it's a staffing company or a direct placement company.
My understanding, Carl, is that there was no case approved in the past 60 days. So you're saying you have cases approved in the past 2 months?
Usually we have a whole rush going on. I can't tell you exactly, but we just had nobody denied ever in Manila. So I don't, I appreciate what's going on and getting a heads up about this, because I think we have some appointments coming up next week and the week after that.
I don't think they dare to deny any of Carl's cases.
They know I'll sue them. I'll sue them.
Exactly.
It's a big worry for a lot of people. And I think, as all of you have said, it's something that comes up at consulates, or, we encounter these issues. But I think for everybody watching who's really worried about it, and of course it is a big worry because it's very disheartening to go through this whole long journey and get to the end and then have this as the end result. And you can feel, everybody can feel very, very frustrated and very upset about it. But I think, as Chris had mentioned, there is good news, and for everybody to know, there's a lot of efforts in the US to rectify the situation. From both a legislative perspective, a lot of the hospital systems. I mean, there are enormous efforts going on. Carl, there's a lot of activity behind you.
Yeah.
Sonia's trying to fix your light coming through. You're trying to fix the light coming through.
Is that better? No, or
it's a little better.
It's okay.
Better.
It's a little better. Okay, so thank you everybody for your comments in that regard. We are hopeful that this situation will rectify itself soon. Just for you to know, there's a lot of efforts going on to help resolve it, and we'll keep everybody posted. And as Chris also said, because we're getting a lot of these comments, a lot of people really worried. If you're at another embassy, we don't seem to be having that kind of issue at all. So don't get too worried about that.